one thing that's definitely true, and I don't need to tell you this. You live and breathe the New York real estate industry, but it's genuinely people who think a lot about New York City and people who think a lot about the future of New York City. And so I think at its best, it can be an opportunity to be talking in decades and generational terms in a way that few other industries really are accustomed to thinking on these long time scales. But when we're thinking about climate, this is exactly the time scales we want to be thinking about. We want to be thinking about, what is New York City going to look like physically in the year 2050, in the year 2100? Where will the coastline be in a slightly different place? Will we need to adapt the structures that we're building to last 80 years, 90 years, 100 years? They need to not just be ready for a changing climate, but need to be built in such a way to minimize the dire consequences of a changing climate.
This is the Real Estate Interview, a series of in-depth conversations with those making a dent in the real estate business. I'm your host, Hitan Samtani.
My guest today is Ben Furnas. He's the director of the New York City's Office of Climate and Sustainability. The de Blasio administration has made some significant dents in addressing the existential topic of climate change, particularly when it relates to the built environment. There's been some landmark laws passed, such as Local Law 97, which deals with building emissions, as well as a new law that is going to ban gas hookups in new construction in a few years from now. So we're going to talk about all of that. We're also going to talk more broadly about the de Blasio administration's legacy when it comes to climate change and the built environment. Ben, thanks so much for being with The Real Deal.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Hitan. It's great to be here.
We're talking just a couple of weeks after a pretty major milestone in not only maybe New York City policy, but probably when it comes to energy policy in the US. So let's maybe just start right there. Why is this ban on gas in new construction such a big deal?
So one thing I would say is, I think there's been an increasing level of consensus from everyone from the state government to the federal government to international energy agencies as we think about deep decarbonization, that one really important piece of this is shifting away from fossil fuels, and one important place where we do that is shifting away from using fossil fuels in our buildings. So when we're generating heat in our boilers or hot water in our hot water heaters, it's really important that the next generation of buildings be electric. What this law really says is that here in the 5 boroughs in New York City, the real estate capital of America, the richest country in the history of the human species, the next generation of buildings is going to be electric buildings. And that really puts a marker down, not just for the United States, but really for the world, that this is the direction. Got a really broad and diverse real estate industry, incredible design professionals, engineers, architects. And we think we can get it right here. And we really think that the lessons that we learn as we take this leap can be applied around the country and around the world.
Does that tend to happen, though? Is there some sort of, New York leads the way on, it certainly happens in, financial innovation. If there's a real estate model to finance something or a new debt instrument or something, if it's implemented in New York, you do see it sort of pop up all over the country. Is that also the case with sustainability initiatives in your experience?
New York is a particularly complicated and challenging place. And like the song says, there's really a sense that if you can do it here, you can do it anywhere. So if you're a smaller, medium-sized city and your director of sustainability comes to you in the mayor's office and said, hey, like New York just did this really ambitious thing, there are not very many excuses why a smaller city couldn't take this leap, because, we have a very high level of complexity, high level of difficulty, and we can really be leading the way on this and many things. About 2/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions in New York City come from our buildings. About half of that is fossil fuels burnt on site. The other half is the electricity usage that comes from burning fossil fuels on the grid. And if we're going to be achieving dramatic emission reductions, like the UN and the world scientists articulate that we really have to in order to stave off climate change, a big part of that is going to be shifting away in our buildings. Shifting away from the use of fossil fuels, improving the efficiency of our buildings, cleaning up the grid so that electricity is being used in a more thoughtful way. And
what was the main sort of source of pushback from the real estate industry?
The technology that we're really looking towards, particularly to provide a comfortable interior, so building heat and cooling, is a technology called the heat pump. And heat pumps are used really across East Asia and Scandinavia, and climate's not so dissimilar from New York. And they currently are a real, cost competitive technological solution to be building all electric, high efficiency buildings. I think as with many things, as we're sort of trying to navigate and push an industry and work closely with industry to spur innovation, we think it makes sense to set some deadlines for us and work to bring these things into even better cost competitiveness, ideally even less expensive to be able to develop an all electric building. And we think the timelines that we work closely with the city council to develop are thoughtful in that regard. So 2023 for buildings 7 stories and below, the sort of modest apartment buildings and smaller buildings, we think the technology is really there and cost competitive to be able to provide at scale. And 2027 for the larger buildings, 7 stories and above. But we're pretty clear that by setting these dates certain, the entire industry can sort of gear up and prepare. One thing I was really heartened by through this entire process is there was actually pretty broad consensus that this was ultimately the direction that the industry needed to go. A lot of the questions and a lot of the dialogue was really around what are the timelines, what are the certain particular exemptions or differential treatment for certain types of fossil fuel usage that does exist in buildings. But there was really a broad consensus that the overwhelming majority of buildings in the decades ahead should be built, maximally electric, and that electricity should come from clean and renewable sources. And there are, developers of very large, very, very complicated, buildings of all types that are in the 5 boroughs building all electric now. And it was really useful to be able to hear from them, understand what their process was like. On Flatbush Avenue, Alloy is building a very large all electric building. Their voice, the voice of Hines, is also building some all electric structures. It was exciting to sort of see the sort of cutting edge of the industry itself, being able to educate us and also their peers about what the next generation of buildings could really look like.
You mentioned Hines, and I thought that's a really good place to get into the next thing, which is Hines is a global sort of asset manager, has a lot of interests in countries that are way ahead of the US in terms of climate policy, right? In terms of how progressive they are with climate policy. It's an institutionalized ownership model. New York, in many cases, is not a 5 families model, but definitely dominated by these sort of dynastic landlords who've been around for generations, who have run things a certain way for the longest time. In many cases, Hines is a chief carbon officer, for example. In many cases, these landlords who own millions and millions of square feet are very mom and pop in their operations. So I was wondering, in your experience, when you're dealing with these mom and pops who are giants, but they're still run in a certain way, how they're thinking about their portfolios. They tend to hold forever.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's definitely true, and I don't need to tell you this, you live and breathe the New York real estate industry, but it's genuinely people who think a lot about New York City and people who think a lot about the future of New York City. And so I think at its best, it can be an opportunity to be talking in decades and generational terms in a way that few other industries really are accustomed to thinking on these long time scales. But when we're thinking about climate, this is exactly the time scales we want to be thinking about. We want to be thinking about, what is New York City going to look like physically in the year 2050, in the year 2100? Where will the coastline be in a slightly different place? Will we need to adapt the structures that we're building to last 80 years, 90 years, 100 years? They need to not just be ready for a changing climate, but need to be built in such a way to minimize the dire consequences of a changing climate. There's a temptation to just figure out ways to keep doing things the way that we have been doing. But I think at its best, it can also be a mindset that actually fits quite nicely into thinking strategically and long term about climate, and particularly with electric buildings, right? I think because there is this broad global consensus, because you see these large global companies making these commitments to get to net zero emissions, a big piece of that is being able to exist in buildings that don't have fossil fuels that are being combusted on site, that are consistent with total zero emissions operations. And that means building this next generation of all electric buildings. And, I think it is good for New Yorkers to have those structures be built all electric. It means cleaner air in the neighborhoods. It means, cleaner air and more comfort for the tenants. But it also is great for these companies and landlords and developers to get in the habit of building structures that these, major global companies that have these carbon pledges will be enthusiastic about, renting space in and occupying. Ideally, in my wildest dreams, I'd love for New York City to have an industry that knows how to build these buildings really well and can share that knowledge and start developing in other cities and sharing our expertise. If New York City's buildings can be a sort of model for climate friendly real estate development, I think that's a model that people are hungry for. They want the smartest folks on earth to be figuring out this really hard problem, and I think a lot of those people are here in the 5 boroughs.
Let's talk a little more broadly about how kind of real estate escaped the glare for so long. When you think about industries that are pollutants, you think about maybe transportation, the energy industry, but then you look at the stats a little more closely, and real estate is what, depending on which metric you look at, but a third of carbon emissions at least, major strain on sort of the environment. How has it sort of got away with it for that long?
Yeah, I think I might put this a little bit differently. I think for a long time, very reasonably, because of the major seeing transportation as a major source of so many of the United States emissions, right? Like when people think about fossil fuels, they tend to think about the internal combustion engine under the hoods of their cars, right? We think about cars. And I think that is true. It's a major source of greenhouse gas pollutants across the country. And it's about a third of our emissions here in the 5 boroughs. And why is it just a third of our emissions? It's because most people, or a huge number of people, take an electric vehicle to work called the subway, right? I mean, we have real estate and a built environment that means that people can live without a fossil fuel vehicle. It means they can hop on the subway to get around. And I think for many years, and very appropriately, that sort of compact urban living pattern that means that you don't have to drive to get around, to do your shopping, to get to work, to visit your friends. That in and of itself was seen as sort of a model. And I think it still is in a lot of ways, right? And something I always say is, just building a building in New York City, if you can get people to live on a subway line instead of, in a detached single family home somewhere where you're driving a fossil fuel car everywhere you go, that in and of itself is a major climate action. But when we look at these really deep emission reductions that we're looking to achieve, and when we look at what New York City could be doing to reduce its contributions to climate change even more, we start to look at not just the fossil fuels that are burned in the buildings themselves, so for heat and hot water, but also the fossil fuels that are used to generate the electricity that powers not just every plug in the wall in every building, but also the subway and also electric vehicles, and everything else that we're looking to shift towards. So, the stat in New York City is about 2/3 of our emissions come from the fossil fuels used to heat and cool and power our buildings, largely because our transportation emissions are so low, that fraction is higher. So, it's not that our building emissions are in an absolute amount greater than any other place. It's just the transportation emissions are so much lower that it's a much higher fraction.
I wasn't pinpointing New York City as much here as much as I was the real estate industry in most cities is not thought of sort of as, this is like the cause number one we need to tackle. And I wonder why that's been the case.
I think it is a little bit more invisible, right? We're really talking about boilers and hot water heaters, right? This is something that we sort of take for granted in lots of places. It's not sexy like an electric car, but it's a big chunk of our ongoing greenhouse gas emissions is from the fossil fuels used to heat our buildings. And I think there's sort of It's inconvenient to renovate your home. It's inconvenient to swap out your heater. It's not sexy. It's not interesting. It's not trading your Camry for a Tesla, which is sort of a sexy, exciting transition to make.
You mentioned Local Law 97. It is obviously the goal is to try to tackle emissions in buildings. But the way it was described to me by someone you probably know very well, John Mandyke from the Urban Green Council, he said Local Law 97 is a blunt instrument and it doesn't really incentivize for density. And New York City, the way it's developed and the way it should go, really should incentivize for density, right? This law was fiercely contested by the real estate industry. This was a fist fight, as opposed to maybe the one we just talked about. This one was a really, really sore point between the industry and the city.
To be very fair to the law, there are currently 7 different use group categories, if I'm not mistaken, and there are specific targets depending on the usage. The Department of Buildings actually right now is undergoing a process to have even more granular categorization to help make sure that the targets that we're hoping people aspire to are ones that are reasonable for the uses that are going on in their building. So, it makes a lot of sense that we should be pushing folks. We should be holding ourselves to be the most efficient version of ourself, but not to compare the activities of a law firm with the activities of an industrial process. And this law really sets out the reasonable but ambitious targets in order to reduce our own emissions, in order to achieve these really deep decarbonization targets that we know are necessary. One thing I would say is there's a mechanism in place right now to be working to reduce emissions from individual building systems, and there's also the way the law is structured is it's really going after what we can measure and what we know is important, which is the carbon emissions associated with building operations and building systems. There's a component of that is electricity drawn off the grid. There's a component of that that's on site in the furnaces and hot water heaters.
And the component that's off site is not under control of the property owner, right? They have no control over how that goes.
That's right. And interestingly, the extent to which we are making investments in cleaning up the grid, and the extent to which we are working actually pretty closely with REBNY to catalyze new investments in transmission and making it easier than ever to build solar and storage in the 5 boroughs. All of these things together make it easier for us to hit these targets that are in Local Law 97. And we've set up new financing programs. So property assessed clean energy financing or PACE financing, which provides an ability to get low interest loans to invest in clean energy projects and pay it off on the property tax bill. So it runs with the building rather than the individual lender, which means it's much more favorable financing. And this is not something that we take lightly.
Is this law really tackling energy efficiency, which is what we're probably going for, right? That's the goal, is energy efficiency, or is the goal?
I think that right now the law is targeting carbon emission reductions, right, which is actually what we're going for, right? So something that we heard certainly in the context of the law when it was being drafted was let's set a target that focuses on what we're actually trying to do and give the market, give individual building owners, give individual businesses some options of what they could do, but really make sure it's a little bit flexible. So if something that makes sense in one type of building, as long as emissions are going down, as long as we're reducing our contributions to climate change, we're very agnostic as to how individual building owners meet their targets.
New York is, it's a place that creates markets in so many different products and commodities. We're talking about carbon removal right now. Would the city, do you think, in your opinion, I know but do you think the city would support a sort of cap and trade or carbon trading market and try to work with landlords and other groups to figure out a way to make that happen?
I think it's a very high level of complexity. The only other municipality that has ever done something even remotely like this has been in Tokyo, and it was done with many, many, many fewer buildings. It was a much simpler sort of market. I think the level of complexity and difficulty in the vast array of buildings that are participating in Local Law 97 would make it daunting. But
you have a market for air rights, for example, and that's not easy either, right?
Yeah, I think if it can be demonstrated that this is really a way to have us achieve deeper emission reductions than we otherwise would be, or this means that they can be achieved faster than they otherwise would be, I think it's an interesting idea. I do worry a little bit, and now I'm just being candid, that there's a great desire in this work for folks to be able to sort of write a check and make this go away, right? That anything to sort of avoid the challenging work of looking at our own building systems, thinking about ways to either operate them more efficiently or upgrade them more efficiently, or be shifting to different technologies in our own building systems. This is not easy work, and I'm the first to acknowledge that this is challenging and inconvenient. And on some basic level, yes, there are lots of advantages, but on some level, it is genuinely a challenging thing for us all to be doing as a city and as a society and as a world, to shift away from fossil fuels in order to slow global warming.
I wanted to ask you just more broadly now, this is your last week on the job. You are stepping down as the director of the climate office for New York City. You will not be joining the Adams administration. So maybe let's just talk more broadly about your time. You've spent about 8 years in the administration. Mayor de Blasio, the optics of his administration versus what he's actually carried out, there's quite a big gulf in many cases, specifically also when it relates to your wheelhouse. So, when you think about Mayor de Blasio, you might think about the SUV that goes to Park Slope and the guards, and that's something that's been a sticking point throughout his administration. But when you look at the actual policies at a broader scale, he's achieved quite a lot when it comes to sustainability.
Being in this office has made it pretty clear that, contrary to what you might expect, I think Bill de Blasio is genuinely the most ambitious climate mayor in America right now. I think between his very clear-eyed view that we need to be shifting rapidly away from fossil fuels in everything that we do, from the pensions that our pension funds are investing in, to the fossil fuels used in our buildings and our electricity system. He's made major moves too. But I think you're right that a major legacy piece, something where he's really distinguished himself, has been on the built environment, has been on building systems, and not just investing real political capital to put in place Local Law 97, to make it clear that we can't achieve these deep emission reduction goals without tackling existing buildings, without looking really hard at our existing buildings, thinking about ways they can be improved, think about ways they can be made more efficient, think about ways we can be shifting away from fossil fuels. And I think he really put his political capital on the line to get this done. And I think as we look forward and we look back and we see these major investments being made to improve efficiency all across the 5 boroughs, I think we'll think back and say, wow, that was really sort of a pivot point in New York City's emission reductions. I think this most recent phase of passing 2317, which is the electric buildings law, I think that makes it clear that that's the direction we're going in the future as the sort of next generation of structures gets built in the 5 boroughs. And Local Law 97 will be sort of working to shift over time the existing building systems, the built environment, to shift more and more away from fossil fuels. Another really, really major accomplishment that we just finalized just last week was this set of contracts to power New York City government with 100% clean and renewable electricity.
And Canadians and upstate.
We're the sort of the biggest purchaser of electricity off of these lines, meaning that they can get financing and they can go to the Public Service Commission and say, New York City is putting up this major commitment to purchase electricity off of these lines, so we can now feel a level of confidence to say that
you're making the market. You're making the market.
Making the market,
right? And
more importantly, we're genuinely creating a new physical reality, which is that these 2 new transmission lines will be built. That helps not just air quality in the 5 boroughs, not just good for climate, but as we talked about, those two investments mean that building owners who are facing local law 97 obligations will have a much cleaner grid than they otherwise would. So even as we were holding all of ourselves accountable by putting in place these local law 97 targets, we weren't just relying on building owners to do everything. The city is also stepping up and supporting them in a major way by putting tax levy into catalyzing these new transmission lines, which means that the grid is going to be a whole lot cleaner than it otherwise would be, which means that the local 97 obligations are a little bit lighter than they otherwise would be.
Do you think a lot of the optics of these sort of these shenanigans with the gym and do you think that dents the legacy at all? Because if we're talking about substantive stuff, what we just talked about, but there is this, when you think of him, I'm just talking about the immediate visual. And I think it's important because when you're thinking about a leader and how they come across, these things do matter.
I'd like to think with a little bit of time and space that folks will sort of look back and see the sort of material changes and the sort of the individual activities sort of fades into the background. I will note that for quite some years now, it has been an all electric Pacifica. So it's not a fossil fuel SUV. Michael Bloomberg would fly to Bermuda periodically for his own relaxation. I don't begrudge him that, but that also had a major carbon footprint, right? Like I think it's genuinely important for those of us who are, passionate about, fighting climate change and reducing emissions, recognizing that a lot of these things are at the level of systems and technological advancement, and making sure that, we want to make sure that people can live full lives, full of doing all the wild things that human beings like to get up to, but do it without contributing to global climate change.
Well, Eric Adams has made it very clear that, he is going to be a mayor of big business. He's going to be very friendly to big business interests. He's not going to, these are not his words, but he's not going to let silliness come in the way of getting New York back to work. That's kind of his ethos. Are you concerned that any of this stuff will hamper some of the work that you and your team have done? Any of his policies that are, unabashedly pro-business? He's not spoken out against, climate change. I'm not saying that, but he's very much like business has got to work and we have to get out of the way of that. So any concerns that the stuff that you've done may be, pushed back a bit?
I genuinely think that as we think about the great companies and the great new firms of the 21st century, a lot of them will be in the business of transforming energy systems, electrifying buildings and vehicles, and dramatically reducing our contributions to climate change. I genuinely think there's been a total sea change at the height of American capitalism and business in the way they think about climate change. And even as recently as 15 years ago, you would sort of go down the Fortune 500 and you saw a lot of folks who were really pushing back against taking climate action. You look at that very same list today, you have some of the most ambitious entrepreneurs associated with finding climate solutions. And I think if New York City is going to be a city of global capitalism and of big business, it needs to be at the forefront of climate solutions.